Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's Specifying Practice Group. Our topic for today will be on FM 4470. We'll go through how it's changed, things you might need to know about it, and even just what is FM 4470 if you're not familiar. Just keep in mind for today, our thought leaders are Dave Stutzman and Louis Metcalf. Dave is a registered architect, certified construction specifier, and founding principal of Conspectus, a specifications and quality assurance consulting firm. Louis is an architect, certified construction specifier. Louis manages the specifications and quality assurance programs for Gresham Smith & Partners, a national architectural and engineering interiors and planning firm. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Dave and Louis to get started with the first practice group of the new year.
Great. Thanks very much, Matt. This is Dave Stutzman coming to you from beautiful, sunny southern New Jersey, and you would hardly know it was a gorgeous day from all of the traffic problems I saw in Philadelphia this morning, but that's a whole different story.
And this is Louis Metcalf in rainy Nashville. It's been raining most of the week and looks like it's going to rain for another couple of days.
All right. Well, welcome to the new year, too. Just as Matt said, it's hard to imagine we're already at 2013. The holidays are behind us, and gosh, now we have a whole nother 12 months to wait, don't we, to get to this time of year again.
All right. This is the changes to FM 4470. That is a standard for, well, you can see the title, the rather lengthy and catchy title here on the screen. I'm not going to read it to you. And they made some changes. The changes were actually made in the middle of last year, but they became effective as of the 31st of December past, just a few days ago. And so what we're going to talk about today is how those things might affect us in terms of our specifications and even our contract administration. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about what FM is. It stands for Factory Mutual, and Factory Mutual Global is basically an insurance company, and they insure primarily large commercial projects. And I haven't actually done that many projects that were insured by FM. I did do a few years ago actually a hotel in northern Michigan that was, but I understand that they're really big in the industrial market, and Dave has a little more experience, I think, with that than I do.
Yeah, we've done a good number of FM insured projects, but one of the things that we find is starting a project when we first ask about the owner's insurer, oftentimes the architect is really unaware. And sometimes it's our question that even prompts them to find out that it's a FM insured building, which brings into a whole nother play of review.
Yes, because not only does FM have certain standards for construction, and not just for roofs, but for exterior walls and other things, they will actually review the documents and make comments on them. And so all of a sudden you've got a whole new extra set of rules that you have to follow, as well as the code, and as well as if the owner's got their own standards for products and materials. So
FM is what? It's an insurer, and they're looking out for, what are they looking out for, do you think, Lois?
Not to pay out claims.
I bet that's one of their top priorities.
To make money for their stockholders. And they have done a great job in terms of developing a number of tests and procedures and standards to minimize those claims and to try to come up with some superior forms of construction so that they don't have to pay out those claims. And they do that really for their own sake. Now, the standards are not developed as a public standard, so they're not like an ASTM where the standards, you don't have to be a member of ASTM for public review and comment Building codes are open to public review and comment, and many other industry standards are open to public review and comment. But it's my understanding FM Global, I suppose you could send them your comments, but they don't have a formalized process that I know of for that kind of public review. So they are going to do things the way they want to do them. And
right. Well, their concern here is really all about preventing property loss.
Exactly, and that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying that they're going at it from a single viewpoint and a sole source, so to speak, without having to reach. They don't have to reach a consensus, I guess, in the industry. They can do pretty much whatever they want to do.
Right, and if they're going to write the insurance policy, then a lot of times, too, what we see is they're taking what may be the code requirements and actually making them more stringent. For instance, having smaller fire compartments. So you end up with more fire walls to separate the building to limit the potential property loss.
And weren't you saying that earlier that when an architect has a serious disagreement with an FM requirement, that they can get it accepted, but that it may affect the premium cost to the insured?
It's all in a negotiation, isn't it? I mean, if the owner is unwilling to limit what may be a property loss, they're going to end up paying for it. So just because FM does make a requirement, my experience is that it's not necessarily a cast in stone requirement that you can negotiate it, but it may end up with an increased premium. We have a comment, our first.
Okay.
From Ron Lincoln, and he's saying that FM 4470 is referenced by the Michigan Building Code 2009.
Oh, that's interesting.
Based on IBC.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
because it's not in the IBC.
Well, he says it's based on IBC 2009.
There is one FM standard that is referenced by the IBC, and right now I'm pulling a blank. I have it here in my notes somewhere, right next to my heart.
Quick! I hope you can find it.
We'll see. One of the things because these are done for the benefit of a private company and its customers, these standards and tests and so forth, a few years ago, FM actually sort of discouraged people who were not insured by their company from using the standards. Obviously, they couldn't limit it because they're fairly public, but they weren't. They had mixed feelings about it. It's my understanding. But in recent years, all of the documents are available without charge on their various websites. They have 2 or 3 different websites. And so you can get on there and you can download a copy of this 4470, the 4450, and the 128, 129, all the other standards that to your heart's content. You just have to register for them.
Yep. And that's been something relatively recent too. It used to be the only way you could even get copies of the standards were through one of the insureds. So it's nice that they've been able to make them available for virtually anybody's use.
So here are some of the... Now, FM has a lot of standards that cover different areas. All the things dealing with roofing are in Series 1, or actually I should say construction. FM property loss prevention data sheets that start with 2 are for sprinklers, 3 for water supply, and so forth. There are actually 17 different categories. And as I mentioned before, the FM actually has multiple websites. We'll list them at the end of this presentation. The roofnav.org replaces the big thick book that used to be available that lists the approved roof systems approvals. And we might state that FM has distinguishes between the term approval and acceptance. If it uses the term approval, that means a blanket general approval that you can use those products or that system in your construction and it will be insurable. And acceptance means that there may be a departure from their normal standards, but they will accept it or approve it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, we have a couple more comments here.
Okay.
One is just a clarification on the Michigan requirement.
Yes.
Gerhard Guth, I believe it is, says Michigan specifically references the 92 version of FM 4470. So apparently that's a state modification to IBC.
Okay.
And Randy Chappell.
And where would you get a copy of that is the question that we might ask the state of Michigan.
Well, that would be a very good question too.
Because obviously FM is not continuing to publish the 92 version, that being a few years ago.
Right. And Randy Chappell says that it's his experience that FM does not usually negotiate, and the exceptions do not always result in a premium increase. And Randy, you may very well be correct on that. I know the projects that I've had the most experience with FM have been very large industrial type clients, and it could be that because it's a large owner that they have maybe a little bit more negotiating room with FM.
And it also depends upon what's being negotiated. You know, obviously, even with the codes are not as black and white as some people would like to think they are. And often you can sit down with the building official and discuss the interpretations and alternative solutions to achieve the end goal. And I'm sure that FM is pretty much the same way. There is a different standard that does have the ANSI imprimatur for testing wind uplift pressures, and then the global property loss prevention data sheets that we're most familiar with. That's 1-28, and again we explained that the 1 refers to the class 1 roof assemblies, and so people sometimes refer to these as I-28 and I-29, but it's really the number 1. And the 128 wind design sort of competes with the ASCE 7 for wind design. We'll talk about that in a minute. The 129, the Roofdeck Securement, that's the one that a lot of us have been citing for years in our specifications as the requirement for the number and type of fasteners to hold insulation down to a steel deck. And FM even has a loss prevention thing for green roofs.
Yep. And that one was a little bit controversial too, because that was withdrawn for a while and just came back again this last year.
Oh, I hadn't heard that.
Yep. So they did some modifications on it and then reintroduced it.
Okay. Presumably it does not cover these inadvertently green roofs, as I'm showing here.
I like that.
Well, it's a hospital, and it gives the folks in the patient rooms something to look at.
I see.
Other than a parking lot.
That's great.
Here's what the IBC requires in the section 1504.3. That's the general area in which all the roofing requirements are found. You have to resist certain design wind load pressures. and per 1609, and that requires the calculations by ASCE 7. Now the calculations are, you take the wind speed for your area, you take the terrain factor, you take the height of the building, you take the importance factor. A hospital's more important than a warehouse, for example, and there's a rather complex set of calculations that you go through to find out what wind uplift pressure you should be designing for.
Yeah, and there are some fairly simple programs out there. I know I had found one that was essentially just an Excel spreadsheet where you can plug all of the required information in, and it'll come back and calculate all the design pressures. And one of the things that I struggle with as a specifier, and we get architects don't always understand the difference, is that if you look at the code and it says that you're designing to 90-mile-an-hour basic wind speed, that does not mean that you need to be specifying an FM 1-90 rated roof.
No,
those two are not equivalent.
Yeah, that has the number for the classification for the wind uplift is an arbitrary number that is not related to pressure or wind speed or anything. It's just they go in increments of 15.
Oh, wait, Lewis.
Yes.
No, there is a distinction there. The FM number,
yes,
the 1-90, means that it will resist 45 PSF uplift. Take the FM rating, divide by 2.
And have it, you're right.
Divide by 2. That's the uplift pressure.
You're absolutely, I remember now that I did run across that lately. Now on the calculations, the IBC requires that the wind load pressures be calculated by the American Society of Civil Engineers document 7. But I have an article in my archives from Interface magazine from March 2005 by a roofing consultant who goes through calculations on 3 different kind of hypothetical buildings, and in some cases the FM is more conservative, and there are cases where the ASCE 7 calculations are actually more conservative. And so we'll talk about that again later in the program too.
Okay. Yes, I want to interrupt you. I think we have an excellent question here from Larry Norton. He wants us to ask everybody online today if you're specifying, or who does the calculations, or do you just list the criteria in the specifications? So we don't have any polls set up, so I'd just like to ask everybody if you could raise your hand if you are specifying design criteria without listing actual uplift pressures. We're getting a pretty good response here. It looks like of those, we've got about a 50% response, maybe 60%.
Okay.
Saying that they are listing criteria only without uplift pressures.
Well, why don't you ask, are the other folks then does the structural engineer do those calculations? I would think the structural engineer would have to do those calculations almost all the time anyway to be able to know how to hold his steel deck down to the steel framing.
Okay, for everyone else that did not just raise their hand, are you relying on your structural engineer to give you the wind uplift pressures? And are you documenting those?
Yeah, I see some hands coming up.
Well, I put those
Not
two
many.
groups, well, but put those two groups together, and it looks like that's pretty much everybody.
Okay.
So it looks like we have a split between the two methods, but it looks like the favorite is still just specifying the criteria.
Okay.
Thank you,
then
Larry.
a couple of other IBC requirements. there is the systems have to be tested for that uplift resistance, and I think this is the only, see, I found it, David. This is the only place that I know of where the IBC references, with respect to roofing, an FM document. And the FM test method 4474 can be used, as well as the 2 UL test methods. The 580 we see more often on metal roofs, but it can be used for membrane roofs too.
Okay, I knew you'd come up with it.
And then finally, the metal edge securement for low slope membrane roofs has to be tested per the SPRI, that's the Single Ply Roofing Industry, ES-1.
And
you can't just pick it out, you can't just design it by the SMACNA manual anymore.
Right, and yeah, just to make sure everybody understands that really is just the roof edge. So it's all your perimeters, whether it's the coping or a fascia, right, or just a roof edge. Yep. Okay, we have more comments if you want to take a break.
Okay, sure.
Right. Let's see, we have from Robert Bowman, let's see, also some roofing manufacturers will calculate uplift, such as Garland. So there's a way to try to get the design pressures if your engineers may not be too willing. We have another comment from George.
And I think that's probably more common, especially on the larger projects, because if the manufacturer is going to be on the hook for 20 or 25 years or 30 years for no dollar limit warranty, they're going to look at that pretty closely, and they're going to figure out exactly what needs to be done. Now, they probably have a lot of that stuff pre-calculated, and they know what to do, and tell the roofing subcontractor how many fasteners to use at the corners, the edge, and the field.
Okay, we have another comment here from George Wadding, who's a roofing contractor, an estimator.
Oh, great.
Roofing contractor. And George, I would ask, are you on the phone or do you have a microphone available? If you are,
we'd love to.
I'd like to get you on the line and have you present your question and help open that up for discussion. Matt, can we try to unmute George in case he is able to join us? I don't see him coming on. So, all right, so let me do the response or the question here. He says he is an estimator for a large roofing contractor, and he says, I have a comment. I work in an area where wood structures are widely used on a high percentage of commercial and institutional buildings with half-inch plywood or OSB sheathing. Many design professionals call for the roofing to comply with the requirements of FM and often require some sort of affirmation that the work will comply. The issue is that the printed FM material is that plywood sheathing must be treated 3/4 inch minimum plywood. Few, if any, of these buildings will be FM insured.
Yeah, frankly, I don't do that many wood frame buildings haven't done that many over the years, and I'm not sure what FM requirements are. Our presentation today is, of course, focusing on the metal deck roof structures. So perhaps one of our listeners has more experience in that area than we do.
Right, and I wasn't aware, George, that FM was requiring the minimum 3/4 inch, and for it to be, I guess you're saying preservative treated. The preference I know in the structures that I'm dealing with would never be using 3/4 inch plywood on a roof, usually because the framing is close enough that it wouldn't necessitate it for structural purposes.
Yeah, because you're not going to have your joist spaced that far apart.
Right. Okay, John Gwill has a question. Does anyone know offhand if 1504.5, that's the IBC reference, if it applies to SPF roofing?
I believe it does, because it's talking about membrane roofs.
Okay. You ready for more questions, or do you want to press on?
Yeah, no, if they're relevant.
All right. Wayne Yancey is just chiming in saying the current date for FM 4470 is June 2012.
Yes, we saw that in the first slide, actually had that date on it.
And here's another comment coming in from George about the plywood roof. An additional issue on many of these buildings is that the perimeter metal nailers are seldom, and George, the comment got cut off, seldom constructed, and if you could finish it, I'll read the rest of it. Joe Anatrella comes in and says, FM requirements should not be stated in the specifications if it is not an FM insured project. I think you've got some comments on this, don't you, Lewis, coming up?
Yes, we're going to get there. We appreciate that. We appreciate that.
All right, that catches us up to all the comments.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let's talk about the changes to 4470 that, as I stated earlier, are effective at the end of the year, even though they were written back in June. What they are, the primary concern is the steel deck stress. And they've been changed now so that, as you can see, for example, to get a 165 rating, you can only have a maximum span of 6 feet on your deck. Alternative methods of reducing the steel deck stress is to increase the thickness or to increase the grade of steel from 33 KSI to 80 KSI. And there are new fastener tables for 80 KSI steel should people want to do that. Obviously, these things are going to affect the cost of construction. And FM is also, in my third bullet here, reviewing the existing approved assemblies that may, in its opinion, overstress the deck. So there are going to be new tables that are available for the spacing, and there are things that are not quite very clear when we're talking about recovering, when that's permitted as opposed to re-roofing. And again, the distinction that FM draws between those two terms is that recovering is simply going over an existing roof membrane, where re-roofing is a tear-off down to the deck. And then the last bullet, we're talking about using rigid cover boards, and what that means is that may allow you to, it affects the design of the overall roof structure. That is, that the cover boards have to be rigid enough that they do in fact contribute to the stiffness of the overall roof design. So that means it's going to be probably one of the gypsum board products as opposed to a high density insulation board, which has been commonly used.
Right. I just want to jump in here for a little
yes.
Lewis, only because you have up here the 165 rating now for the 6-foot span. And my experience is that generally the structural engineers are going to push the roof framing out to nearly the maximum span for the decking, only because it makes the framing, reduces the overall tonnage of the framing and helps in the construction cost, take the best advantage of the metal deck. But if we're specifying FM 1-90 as the standard, the framing that lets us go out to 6 foot for this metal deck is no longer going to work when you go to the perimeters.
Yes, perimeters and corners.
Right.
Yeah, the 1-165 sounds awfully high, and folks may think that that's a South Florida rating, but in fact, that's a typical corner rating.
Well, I think, maybe a perimeter rating. The corner, I think, with FM 190 is up over 200.
Oh, you're right.
I think it's 225.
You're right. It changed about 3 years ago.
Right. So even if you're specifying FM 1-90, your framing spacing at the building perimeter and corners may not be close enough.
Yes, and incidentally, while we're mentioning the 1-90, a lot of people have been specifying that for the 90-mile-an-hour wind zones, which is one of the most common ones in the U.S., and it's really overkill, especially since they FM increased the number of fasteners and so forth, and the ratings for the edges and the corners. That 1-60 is, FM will tell you that that's the appropriate rating for a 90-mile-an-hour wind speed.
Right, which is generally the design condition for 90% of the contiguous U.S.
Yes.
And the only areas that are above that are the Gulf Coast, the East Coast, and the Alaskan coast.
Yeah, and your house, David.
And yes, and my house. So yeah, I mean, we ought to be at least aware that if we're specifying FM 190, that may be above and beyond where we need to be. Remember, that gets us a 45 PSF uplift, and FM 160 gets us a 30 PSF, which for 2-3-story buildings under a 90-mile-an-hour design wind load is probably more than enough.
Okay, well, what do we do with this information? The first thing to ask...
I know you're going to tell us.
See if we can point some directions. The first thing is to ask ourselves, is it under construction? And if the answer to that is yes, we need to look at the specifications and see. And if we referenced the FM standards, they changed after the specs were issued, and so there may be an ambiguity there as to what's really in effect. And so you need to talk over the roof structural design with your engineer, and it may be necessary to back off on the requirements, because again, if it affects the joist spacing or the thickness of the deck and so forth, the owner and structural engineer may not be happy with doing that, and so we may need to write a change order omitting the FM requirements and going back to a different set of standards based on the ASCE 7 calculations and the manufacturer's recommendations for fastener size and spacing.
Right, and since this all just went into effect, it's important to know where you stand on this.
Yes, and that's what I'm really a little bit more concerned about than anything else, is that we wouldn't want anybody to get caught with this unsuspecting, and because you're going to get a submittal and all of a sudden the roofer says, oh, by the way, your joists are too far apart. If it's not under construction, then we ask ourselves the second question: is it insured by Factory Mutual Global? And if the answer is yes, then we need to calculate the wind loads by both methods and use the more conservative result. We need to brief our structural engineers on the implications of FM 4470. Check the roofnav.org for an approved system. And if you're recovering an existing roof, you may need to have some discussions with your Factory Mutual agent to get some interpretations, because the definition, the rigid cover board, that phrase is not defined in the FM 4470, and so you may have to call them and find out how they interpret that. And of course, as we observed before, you need to build in some time in your design schedule that these things are going to be looked at by FM, and they are going to comment, and you may be required to make some changes.
Yeah, what sorts of things do you know? What might classify as the rigid cover boards yet, Louis?
I suspect the Dens deck, Georgia Pacific gypsum Dens deck, because that's stiff and you can get enough fasteners in that thing and it's not going to go anywhere.
Well, and
one of my roofing contractors or reps, actually the Firestone rep, who first alerted me to this situation back in December, said that it's very common now to use like a high density insulation board for a cover board that gives you a little stiffer surface in terms of for walking on it, but it would not qualify as stiffening up the whole assembly in the way the FMG is concerned about.
Okay. We have a couple more comments here. We have one from Douglas Freeman, and Doug, you started off saying it's a bit off topic, so I think maybe we'll take your comment offline and try to respond to you then. Larry Norton is saying, talking about the 1-165 at the perimeter, potentially.
Yes. David, did I lose you?
Oh, I guess maybe you did because I accidentally hit the mute button. Sorry.
Okay. I thought it was me.
Oh, no, it was me. Wayne Yancey is saying, this is why the performance requirements for field, perimeter, and corners, when we were talking about the potentially the lesser spacing and the framing, why they should be specified with the aid of the structural engineer and the roofing manufacturer. So, and you're right, Wayne, I think that it's going to be an important issue because if we simply rely on a common spacing for all the roof framing and expect that to pick up the loads at the perimeter and corners, it's simply not going to work and be able to meet the FM requirements.
Right, and I see that Doug is corrected. It's roofnav.com, not org. My mistake.
Okay, yes, good. And George is apologizing only because he couldn't get through on the phone. So he's going on to say, additionally, let's see, the common practice here is to specify FM 1-90, which is only rarely applicable, but everyone seems to feel they have covered themselves better by doing so. And George, I think you're right. I think it's almost commonplace that folks are specifying FM 190 today and thinking, and I think this goes back to the notion that the wind speed, the basic wind speed is 90 miles an hour, so it takes FM 190 to comply.
Yes, I think that's the basic level of confusion, and it really is a significant overkill, and it really is a significant cost that is not adding value to the project.
Right. And Wayne Yancey is asking, though, I think this is a good point. What about fully adhered roof systems without fasteners above the underlayment or substrate board?
Are we talking, well, this is not talking about mechanically fastened membranes, although that is, they are governed by that also. This is talking about any low slope membrane roof that's over insulation, and the insulation is mechanically attached to the steel deck. Now, if we're going over a continuous concrete deck, this doesn't apply. That's a whole other set of standards.
Well, it's not only just mechanically fastened insulation, because there could be a vapor retarder in there. So perhaps we have a substrate board that is mechanically attached and a vapor retarder over it, and then everything else above it is adhered. But because it's still attached to the metal deck, this all still applies, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, but and I don't think you can get away with not attaching the insulation to a metal deck, even if you do have a substrate board.
But we have, and we do. Well, and if you think about it, if you're putting down a vapor retarder, you don't want to have penetrations through it.
Well, there is that. That never did. I've only once or twice in my career specified a roof vapor barrier, so it's kind of uncommon for me. But you're right. And of course the whole thing is that the reason we have to secure insulation to a metal deck is because the gaps and the overlaps of the metal deck allow air from inside the building in conditions of low pressure above the roof to explode from the inside of the building and blow the roof off from the inside out. And so if you have a continuous roof deck like a concrete that doesn't leak air except maybe around the edges, there's a whole different ball game, and it would make sense that if you're putting down a complete cover board and then covering that with a vapor barrier that would also act as an air barrier, then that becomes moot.
Hey, I'm going to solve this whole thing.
Okay.
I think we ought to all just promote concrete roof decks and protected membrane roofs.
Oh, I'll go for that.
Then we don't have to worry about any of this.
I'll go for that. The firm I work for in Cincinnati used the T-Clear product a lot. That is the Dow styrofoam, and then a company called T-Clear applies a 3/8 inch concrete facing to it. The boards are tongue and groove, so you put it all together and it acts like this giant raft, and then you do have to do some strapping around the edges and the corners, but it gives you a nice walking surface. The roof is protected from guys dropping screws and stepping on them. It's protected from UV, it's protected from thermal shock, and it's a great roof.
Well, I do like the protected membrane because I think it does a number of different things to help make it a long-term roof. But that's not the subject that we're on today.
No. Okay. So if it is, so we ask if it's insured by FMG. If it's not insured by FMG, what should we do? Well, again, the code requires us to calculate by ASCE 7. If you really want to be conservative, you could also compare that with the FM calculations to see which is the more conservative. And as one of our listeners suggested, there's no real reason to cite the FM documents in specifications if you're not insured by FM. And as a matter of fact, that is the official view of the SPRI, the single-ply roofing industry. Unfortunately, I invited their technical director to join us today, but unfortunately today is the day he's flying to California for one of their national meetings, and so he was unable to join us. But we're going to he gave me his email address, and we're going to list that at the end of the presentation, so if you do have specific questions. But you can also just get on their website and download their they have what they call an industry bulletin that talks about it. But again, if we're calculating the wind uplift pressures, and those are shown on the structural drawings, and we have performance requirements in our specifications, then we can put the manufacturer on the hook for figuring out exactly how many fasteners are needed to hold the insulation down on the metal deck so that it doesn't blow off.
Right, but one of the concerns here too, Lois, is that it goes beyond just holding the insulation down. We have to hold the deck down to the structure.
Yes, and that's one of the things that the FM 4470 changes, is that it's looking at it from a whole thing. Now, somewhere in one of I've got papers all over my desk, I found a statement that said that FM has stated that they have not actually had any significant losses from this issue. Yes, here it is. This is from Mike Ennis, the SPRI Technical Director. And he writes in the bulletin that you can download from SPRI. He says, FM Approvals has confirmed that they have no loss history with mechanically fastened single-ply membranes of 8, 10, or 12-foot wide panels causing damage to the decking or structure. These mechanically attached systems, which have been tested for wind uplift performance at various accredited laboratories, will continue to be offered in the marketplace.
Okay. But my point is here, if we're relying on the roof membrane manufacturer to determine what kind of fastening pattern that they need, it may take that back to the structural design to a point where you're going to have to add additional framing to be able to accommodate that fastening pattern.
Yes, so all that says that we need to think about roofs maybe a little earlier in the game than we're used to doing. And that was always true, really. You know, you should pretty well decide on your roofing system by the end of SD's, schematic design, because frankly the type of roof that you use is going to affect the appearance of the building and other issues related to the design of the drainage system, of the design of the structural system, and so forth.
And you won't be able to complete your energy model unless you know what it is that you're going to be putting on the roof.
Yes. And I see that Wayne backs you up on having done successful roofs over mission-critical facilities with fully adhered systems without fasteners in the insulation. That if you have that, the substrate board, like I say, I haven't done that in years, so I didn't think about it, but you're absolutely right, Wayne, and that's a good point, and thanks for bringing that up.
And I'm hoping that what I'm reading from George is a complete agreement with the protected membrane roofs over concrete decks.
I think so. If I were a roofer, I would be much happier with putting them down on concrete decks than otherwise myself.
Okay, so Louis, you have a little less than 10 minutes to wrap everything up here. And
so, do we have any questions? Any further questions that anybody wants to talk about? One thing, of course, is to not put the roof drain on the column line.
I was wondering if that was the drain in the middle of the photo.
That yellow spot there in the middle of the photo is the roof drain.
That's a great place for it.
Right on top of the beam. I don't know. I don't even know how they installed it. And you can see how effective it is. That was a day and a half after the last rain.
Oh gosh. And we tend to laugh at it, but you know, you see this kind of a detail more often than you would like to, for sure. I have some of the same photos myself. So, was that it? No more questions.
That's pretty much it.
How'd you do that, Louis? We got to the end. We've answered all the questions. Nobody else is chiming in. The tweet chat is quiet. Paul Gerber ran out of things to say.
And Tommy Smith.
I can't believe it. So here we are. Gosh, we'll finish a couple minutes early.
And here are some links. Again, the roof nav should be .com, I think. But there are the other lists, and if you want to make note of Mr. Ennis's email, it's down there at the bottom.
Okay, and he did agree to take all of our questions?
He did, he did indeed. So let's take him up on it. But first, do go to the SPRI website and download. They have two industry bulletins that deal with this issue. One's a little longer than the other, and we encourage you to download those and read them, and get the facts. And there are some other sources on the internet, but we just thought that this would be, since they went into effect at the end of the year, that this would be a good time to kind of discuss it and put people on notice, especially if you have a building under construction or getting started with a design, that it's been very, very common in the past for people to cite the FM standards for non-FM insured projects for roofing, and now I think is the time to say we probably need to move on from that practice to a different procedure.
Now we need to tackle your standard base flashing detail there, Louis.
Yes, not mechanically attached, and I don't think that the 2 or 3 different kinds of sealant that we see there is very effective at keeping out the wind and the rain, especially when you have that many bug holes in the concrete.
I think George would probably have a comment about that detail too. So maybe we can talk about roofing details at some point in the future. Who knows?
Okay. Oh, I did it again. I got Spry and Roofneg mixed up. It's spri.org.
Okay.
We'll fix that before we post this on for later viewing.
Good.
We'll fix those too.
All right. So what are we looking forward to next month?
I did this month, so what are you going to do next month, David?
Well, that's a very good question, and we're going to have to think about that. And I would ask anybody still online here with us, if you have any good suggestions, send them along. The next month is going to be February. We're back to our first Thursday, so it'll be February 7, again at 3 o'clock.
David, that means that we have one less week to prepare.
Yes, thank you very much. You cut my time short, Louis. Okay, I appreciate that. But we'll come up with a good program.
See, when I did this one, I had an extra week to prepare.
I'm going to have to find one of those in the month ahead. All right. Well, thank you very much. But
yes, keep those cards and letters coming in, friends and neighbors, and we'll see what we'll find to talk about. One of the things I've been thinking about talking about, David, is distinctions between systems and assemblies, site-assembled elements versus manufactured elements that come out of a box and get screwed down. How does that affect our Part 2 specifications? I know that's something near and dear to Tommy Smith's heart. He wrote a wonderful article for the Memphis chapter newsletter back when I was the editor, which is a while back.
One other thing I'd like to ask all of our listeners and group members here is another thing that maybe we could do in the future. Do you have or have you seen a new product that might do something to help solve somebody's problems, somebody else here in the group? So if you've seen something new, something interesting, if you could share that with us, maybe we can put together a program just sharing all of these new ideas that we may not all be aware of.
Okay. I see that Paul is suggesting that a program on the subject of your July specifier article regarding storefront and windows.
Well, we could do that too.
Well, we want to thank everybody for putting up with us this afternoon and joining us for this discussion, and we hope it was of some use and encouragement, and we look forward to talking to you next month.
Okay.
Whatever date that is.
Right, yes. We'll see you all then. First Thursday in February. Thanks for joining.